or fantastic, which could have formed the basis of what would subsequently become the Tower Liberties. Although any evidence of these defensive fortifications, which are probably likely to consist of earthworks and ditches, have certainly been destroyed by the subsequent expansion of the fortress into the City of London and the development of the City of London itself. So all we have is our best guess, which is this, which is broadly the work of Edward Impey and others. The next significant series of works in relation to the tower, and you've clicked off the presentation, fabulous. The next significant series of works in relation to the tower is the Angevin expansion of the fortress to the west by Richard I and John I between 1189 and 1216. So this increased the area of the fortress to the extent of the surviving bell tower, likely with a gate in the approximate position of the current Beauchamp Tower, enabling access along Great Tower Street, from which a curtain wall returns to the eastern landward wall. But the larger schemes of work, largely forming the fortress as we know it today, were undertaken by the Plantagenet kings Henry III and Edward I. Henry III expanded the tower both northward and eastwards beyond the limits of the eastern landward defences between the 1220s and 1260s, forming what is largely the current inner curtain wall. Henry III also undertook significant works within the chapel in 1240, which included the replacement of the roof, installation of new windows, repairs, whitewashing, decorative painting, and the installation of large and beautiful stalls for himself and Eleanor of Provence. The layout of the church is also described in this period, showing that it held two chancels, one for St. Mary and another for St. Peter, alongside additional altars to St. Catherine and St. Nicholas. Crucially, the combination of these works show, and the position of the chapel being formally enclosed within the fortress, show that it's moved from being a nondescript parish church on the outskirts of the city to a church associated roughly with a fortress, to a chapel that is in use by the reigning monarch, which turned it into a royal-ish chapel, likely operating as a free royal chapel. During the reign of Edward I, the towers expanded in all directions with the construction of the outer ward, itself ringed by the outer curtain wall and moat, which largely form the general dimensions of the fortress as we know it today, albeit with some bits removed or bastardized by the Victorians. And in between 1286 and 87, what is likely to be the 12th century church, heavily altered by Henry, was demolished and rebuilt with accounts of Ralph of Sandwich, who's then constable of the tower, spending £317, 8 shillings and 3 pence for this great new chapel, although luckily no documents survive showing its location or decoration or layout, which is fabulous. And although extensive works are undertaken elsewhere in the fortress, there is very little documenting the history of the chapel itself until Edward's chapel is destroyed by fire in 1512. So following this fire, the tower's community of craftspeople, soldiers, administrators, polar bears, and everything else were without a place of worship, as the tower's other chapel, St. John's, had since at least 1320 been appropriated as an archive by the Exchequer Record Office. As I say, there would have been other more private chapels which were part of the royal apartments. It is very unlikely any of those could be used for parish worship on the scale that the tower actually needed. And subsequently, the King's Book of Payments in 1519 and 1520 note the payment of £260 to Walter and Thomas Forster, who were successive controllers of the King's works, for the building of a parish church within the Tower of London, under the supervision of Sir Richard Cholmondeley, who was then lieutenant of the Tower, which created the chapel largely as it now stands. The building of a parish church is slightly confusing, but it should be taken in terms of the jurisdiction and the parish of Tower Liberties. It is under the King and not necessarily part of the Diocese of London. The next scheme of works, which are directly applicable to the chapel, was the presumed blocking of the western entrance, which we think is the original, and the construction of an Elizabethan porch on the south elevation in 1559. And this leaves us with the chapel as you can see it in this image. Hayward and Gascoigne's true and exact plan of the tower from 1597. Important to note also on this plan, the area to the north and east is dominated by storehouses, themselves likely built prior to the chapel in the early 16th century. And to the south, a main guard building, also likely to have been constructed in either the late 15th century or the early 16th century. And so, although we have no cartographic sources or descriptions showing us where Edward I's chapel would have been, by looking at this document and understanding the history of all of the other buildings, we think it was probably somewhere in roughly the same place, because there are very few places that aren't occupied within the fortress. And this also helps us to determine the extramural burial ground for both chapels. The main body of the building forms the nave, which leads to the chancel, where the memorial pavement commemorating royal interments is located. And to the north, separated by Reigate arches, which are primary to the building's construction, is a nave aisle which houses the organ and provides access to the vestry and the crypt. The former was built in the 19th century, and the latter is a Board of Ordnance basement which has been repurposed for use as a crypt. The chapel is lit by tracery windows, most of which are Tudor in style, though it appears as though a number, if not all of them, have been replaced at various points in their history. In the eastern elevation of the nave aisle, there is a piscina and a hagioscope or squint. The former, a stone basin, and the latter, an opening in the wall, allows the main altar, to be visible from the northern aisle. And these are distinctive of Catholic or pre-Reformation churches, and tell us that a smaller altar, possibly a laity chapel or something of that ilk, was in that location during the first years of the chapel's existence as a Catholic church. One of the most spectacular features, though, is the exposed Tudor ceiling. And a popular myth of this ceiling is that it is built of Spanish chestnut so that Catherine of Aragon could pray beneath the trees of her homeland. And this presents an enticing picture because Henry VIII is known to have used architecture to impress his many wives, particularly at the tower with the cupolas of the White Tower, which were added in the 1530s before Anne Boleyn's coronation. Unfortunately, like most myths of the tower, we haven't determined where this timber has come from, and there are no documents surviving saying why it was chosen, but it is still quite a nice story. It's during this period that much of the popular history of the building is formed. Numerous executions and burials solidify the building's position within our national memory. Each of these individual stories are incredibly important not only to the history of the chapel, the history of the tower, and the history of 16th century England. But given the limits on time today and the reams of paper that have been published on each of these individuals, I'm going to stick to building archaeology, which is much more my wheelhouse. More important for us is observing the tower's day-to-day function, the chapel's day-to-day function within the tower, serving the community. And this is shown in spectacular fashion through the chapel's registers of burials, baptisms, and marriages dating from 1550, 1580, and 1587, respectively, until 1821. So while some executed individuals are included, such as Thomas Arundel, these records, which are compiled from numerous different sources and by no means complete, paint an entirely different picture of the history of the chapel. Entries for burials, baptisms, and marriages of the people working and living at the fortress, officers, administrators, outnumber prisoners and executions in the order of thousands. So this changes the idea of the chapel from a mausoleum for the greater good into a representation of the community that the chapel cared for. Notably, later entries include individuals of African and Asian descent, including Charles Kennington, John Swan, and Francis Chasey. Both John and Francis are described as being black servants, and though much of these individuals' histories are lost to us, including whether or not they are enslaved, though that seems incredibly likely given the context, these entries allow us to paint a more accurate picture of the tower community as a whole, showing us that the community the chapel served was as diverse as other boroughs and neighbourhoods within London. The tower declined as a royal residence throughout the 16th century, but markedly from the 1530s, as other more fashionable palaces were built rivaling those of the continent. And as a result, the tower was altered on an ever-increasing scale, becoming largely unrecognisable by the time of the Civil War. The fortress was lost during that conflict in 1642, and this was catastrophic, not only as a royal residence, but materially as the administrative centre of the Mint and the Board of Ordnance, but also as a representation of control or lack thereof. And so in 1660, Charles II wasted absolutely no time in recognising the importance of the tower and making it once again the depository of the crown jewels, although the regalia only consisted of 3 swords and the coronation spoon. But this, however, did not signal a resurgence in the tower's royal use, but instead an expansion of its role as the administrative heart of England. And you can see the dramatic change between the 1597 plan and this plan from 1681, showing sprawling storehouses and previously royal buildings and lodgings being altered for more practical uses. This increase in the use of the tower as a store by the Board of Ordnance is shown later in that decade through the construction of the Grand Storehouse in 1688, which is that colossal building to the north of the White Tower. This was the largest building to ever exist within the complex, replacing the Tudor storehouses, which were located to the north and east of the chapel. And this expansion of the civilian and administrative life would have far-reaching consequences for the chapel itself. By 1755, a horrifying gallery is installed within the chapel, projecting from the northern and western walls, which distorted any appreciation of the internal masonry arches. This is important as, despite its catastrophic architectural impact, it is representative of the use of the chapel. This is not an intimate chapel royal being used by the monarch. This is a place of worship that is being altered for the specific goal of fitting more people in it, and increasing the capacity for garrison and various other officers who are living and working at the tower. Not everything was bad though, in terms of changes at the tower, because as we move into the 19th century, we get a dramatic increase in the number of plans and records that are created surrounding the building. The most useful of these is this plan from 1824, which is the first time when the chapel's burial ground can be mapped in any detail. And this shows a large portion of Tower Green, or the northern section of Tower Green, and the parade ground located to the north of the White Tower being used as consecrated ground. I've cropped it out, but there's a proposed expansion of consecrated ground going further east across the parade ground, but it's not actually known if that ever happened. But little appears to change within the building following all of these changes, and the next significant event is when the Grand Storehouse burns down in 1841, and the chapel is incredibly lucky to have survived this event because of its proximity to the fire, although it appears as though the wind was blowing in the other direction, because everybody there seemed to panic a lot about the crown jewels at the Martin Tower. While some timbers and lead were damaged, the wholesale destruction of the garrison of the storehouse would have much more of an impact on the chapel itself. It was now required that a new storehouse be built, and this resulted in the construction of the Waterloo block in 1844 under the direction of the Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke, who was then the constable of the tower. The block was placed immediately to the east of the chapel and resulted in a large quantity of the consecrated ground identifiable in 1824 to be destroyed, as you can see in this plan. And for those of you who haven't been to the tower, this gives you some scale for the delicate consideration of the proportions of the tower by the Victorians and their many different constructions. The next significant period in the history of the chapel coincides with the re-medievalization of the fortress in the latter half of the 19th century by John Taylor and Anthony Salvin, during which a lot of medieval fabric was destroyed to somehow make the tower look more medieval. So in relation to the chapel, the first alteration was in 1862, which was the removal of this insignificant Elizabethan porch on the southern elevation, and the opening of the original entrance, which is the entrance used to go into the chapel today. But following this, between 1876 and 1877, much larger scheme of work was undertaken by John Taylor, and these works focused around the removal of the dark wood and 18th century pews, which you can see in this image, which were felt to be much more representative of a garrison church than a chapel royal. One of the most significant aspects of this work was the restabilization of the floor, which had begun to move owing to the large number of interments. And during this work, the entire of the interior of the chapel was excavated, identifying, and I use identifying very loosely, burials where they could, and removing many for reinterment within the crypt. The total number of individuals who were exhumed is unknown, and nor is there any discussion of stratigraphy or any detailed archaeological recording throughout this process. But what made these works really capture the public imagination was the supposed identification of individuals, including Queen Anne Boleyn. But unfortunately, again, there's no evidence which discusses the stratigraphy or the pathology of the bones, and in particular for Anne, no discussion of the catastrophic damage we would expect by a sword going through somebody's neck. So these assessments appear to have been done with a foregone conclusion in mind. They weren't necessarily, we obviously have to take the Victorian works for what they are, given the context that they're working in, with none of the modern tools that we take for granted. But by assessing the skeletal assemblage as being of slender and perfect proportions, and the neck bones being particularly small, bearing witness to the Queen's little neck, I think we can all agree that these were probably done with the intention of, let's find the lost Queen. And this is, as John said at my lecture at the RAI, this is part of a wider period of creating ruins and forging stories in order to draw people to these kinds of places. And during this period, I can't even begin to count how many famous individuals were found in various different chapels and churches. The Victorians didn't care at all, what I would think there, and they installed the memorial pavement to the chapel's royal interments anyway, excluding the usurper, Lady Jane Grey, who couldn't possibly be remembered in the same way. And this is important for a number of reasons. This pavement serves as one of the most important sites of modern Tudor pilgrimage in England. And although there is no evidence that Anne is underneath that slab, as I've said previously, there's very little evidence for most of the myths of the tower. But what they do have is their own cultural heritage as stories which we have told to other people and ourselves for over 200 years. And they also provide an essential means for people to engage with the tower and its amazing stories. And that's part of what my job is. It's not necessarily trundling along to these events and going, aha, Anne Boleyn wasn't under that slab after all. It's about building on those stories and creating more of a narrative and spreading more nuanced histories about the palaces. But also important for us to remember in this context, being at Lammas, is the impact these large-scale works would have had upon the archaeological record of the chapel, and the almost negligible evidence we have for its development prior to 1519, 1520. Following these works, the floor of the chapel was relaid, and this image acts as a fairly good representation of the chapel as it would have stood following all of those changes, showing a much more intimate space in comparison to the huge gallery and all of the imposing altar box pews. And following this, rather typically, there was another period of renovation in the 70s, which removed all of the Victorian elements of the chapel. And as the chapel moved into the 21st century, a full refurbishment was undertaken in 2014, during which the furniture of the chapel was again entirely replaced. The chapel in this form, as it stands today, was opened by Queen Elizabeth II, I should say the late Queen Elizabeth II, in the same year, and brings us up to the present day in terms of the building's chronology. And so with that baseline, I will now move on to the work that we did in 2019 concerning the excavations outside of the chapel. Firstly, it's important to note that the days of Victorian intervention are long gone. So following the establishment of historical palaces in 1998, the conservation and archaeological methodologies at the palaces have been irrevocably changed. Research excavations are no longer undertaken, and where intervention must be made, it is done so on an exceptionally small scale in order to preserve as much of the stratigraphy of the site as possible. Everything we do in terms of interventive work is based on these principles, but one area where excavation is almost always required is in issues of access. And as you can see in this picture, the chapel is only accessible down a set of stairs. There are other entrances, all of which consist of more sets of stairs, and all of those other entrances take you into the crypt, which is only accessible via the chapel by a set of stairs. So it is not easily accessible for less able individuals, and where historical palaces can, we are determined to facilitate dignified access for as many people as possible into our buildings. So the tower is a fortress. It is hard to walk around. There are places where we will never be able to install a lift, but this is one of them, and hopefully we will do so in the coming years. But this presents a fairly obvious issue. How do you do that in a scheduled monument and in one of the most important buildings within that monument? And the answer to this, after an extensive design phase, was the moving of or extending the stairwell to the west and installing a retractable stair lift. And in the project meeting, we all agreed, yes, this is a wonderful idea. And then I said, have you considered the possibility of human remains? So before we actually moved on to that glorious event of trying to install the stair lift, we had to understand the archaeological potential of this area, which resulted in an extensive period of research, some of which you've heard in terms of buildings chronology, and a lot of which was built on work of previous curators, including particularly George Roberts, who's done a huge amount of work on the chapel, and you have already heard. One of the most interesting parts of this exercise, though, was focused around the 1824 plan that I showed you earlier. So given the history of the site and its potential use since the 9th century, I thought it might be likely that the burial ground had shifted around somewhat. And so to that end, I mapped every location where burials or disarticulated human remains had been encountered within the fortress during modern archaeological excavations. And as you can see, it's clear that the burial ground has moved somewhat. This is supported by historic accounts from the tower as early as 1597, stating that there is not within the tower any place for their burials. And from 1934, when it is stated that Tower Green is a graveyard, any flat stone you tread on is a gravestone, and that a Office of Works superintendent instructed his workmen, if you're working on the green and find bones, don't attract any attention, throw a little dirt on them, put the stone back and walk away. So clearly complying with all the best practices that we have there. And with the identification of this area with reasonable chance of encountering human remains, it was, and crucially with no record of deconsecration, we had to comply with the Burials Act to cover the potential of exhuming those remains should we encounter them. And this took the most time in terms of the project overall, and I almost feel Jane falling asleep again, having another conversation about ecclesiastic law. So the Chapel of St. Peter and Vincula is a chapel royal and a royal peculiar, and it is therefore exempt from the Diocesian hierarchy. It is not, however, exempt from the Burials Act, but there was no one who could actually fulfill that requirement outside of the monarch or the Privy Council. And given that we didn't know where the boundaries of that designation were, I felt it would be prudent to actually work that out before asking anybody for permission to exhume those remains. And this took over a year, probably 3 years of my life, to actually publish this article. But to cut it into a few sentences, this research showed that the chapel was stripped of its designation in 1550 and 1845, officially coming into the care of the Diocese of London. Not that that really mattered to the Chapel Royal, who continued to operate under a rather potent mix of assumed medieval privilege and general contempt for episcopal power. And it was not until 1965 that it was reinstated as a Chapel Royal and a Royal Peculiar, but crucially without any mention of the burial ground. And this meant that the burial ground could be considered as a separate entity legally, with the most recent piece of legislation that affected it determining its jurisdiction. And so the project manager could bypass the complications of a chapel royal and royal peculiar, and because there is no FSE at the tower, FAC rather, or any other measures, and apply directly to the Diocese of London for a faculty. So this work does present complications for the future governance of the chapel, but that is definitely the subject of another talk that I won't bore you with at this particular moment in time. At this point, we had in early 2019, we had scheduled monument clearance from Historic England and a faculty from the Diocese of London, and we were able to undertake a trial excavation that would inform the scale of the major works that would follow for the installation of the platform lift. And I should say that unfortunately this work, the complete installation, has been delayed by the COVID pandemic, during which Historical Palaces lost £110 million. Plug, please donate. Hopefully we should be doing this next year. I think we'll be doing revisiting the design phase, because lifts have come on quite a lot in the last 2 or 3 years. The first pit to be opened was within the stairwell, and within about 5 or 10 centimetres, we could tell that the area was largely undisturbed due to the presence of a mortar floor surface, which is related to an outbuilding constructed between 1681 and 1737, which was used as a coal store. Beneath this surface was a layer of redeposited backfill, which contained Roman jet fragments, glazed medieval tile shards, some of which were decorative, and the almost complete skeletal remains of a dog, which was probably associated with the area's use as a garden by the surrounding residences, but crucially no human remains. This fill, though, surmounted a significant mortar floor surface, which is 22 centimetres thick and was partially covered by a thin layer of ash. So this, and that's in the bottom, I guess it's right-hand corner view. And this is clearly a bedding surface for a floor of some quality, given that it extended beyond the trench in every direction. So it doesn't appear to be a foundational layer associated with the bell tower to the north. And given that it is 0.5 meters below the chapel, and there is no evidence for the construction of narthex or any other building there, although that can't be ruled out at this point, it appears as though this surface may relate to the construction of a previous high status building in this area. And to begin to identify what that could be, again, we come back to the 1597 Hayward and Gascoigne plan. So as I've mentioned, the main guard building and the storehouses to the north and east all appear to have been built prior to the construction of the chapel, and we have no real documentary evidence, aside from some residences between the Beauchamp Tower and the Devereux Tower, for the construction of any significant high status buildings in that location apart from the previous chapels. And so the working idea is that this may form part of an extension to or an outbuilding associated with Edward I's chapel, although it doesn't appear as though it is original to that construction. There are, however, as always with archaeological excavations, various problems with this, as the layer of ash that was deposited over the top of the surface only consisted of a few millimeters and was not representative of the loss of a substantial building. And added to this, 3 burials were cut through the surface, consisting of 2 complete skeletons and 1 partial skeleton, the commingling of which resulted in severe difficulties in interpreting the archaeological sequence. Some answers to this can be found through an assessment of the built archaeology of the chapel. A petrological assessment of the bell tower and western elevation between 1999 and 2001 by Robin Sanderson and Jeremy Ashby showed that the chapel had been built out of a large quantity of recycled material, some of which showed signs of burning, which was probably taken from the burnt out remnants of Edward I's chapel. Additionally, on the western elevation above the door is a window which was discovered in 1862 in decorative rather than perpendicular style, which is probably a reused medieval feature, not one dating to the Tudor period. And although this was replaced with a copy in 1862, each of these features, although there's more work to do, show that the old building was probably cleared and any reusable material cobbled into the construction we now know, which may explain the minimal deposition of demolished material within the trench. The burials, however, still presented an issue. The lowest of the burials was dated by pottery in the fill to the late medieval period and almost certainly predates the construction of the chapel. And the two subsequent interments likely date to the early to mid 16th century, again dated through pottery in the fill. Due to the density of burials in this location, it wasn't possible to see if the lowest burial was cut through the surface or if the surface was overlying those burials, which would have aided in dating it, but it's one of the research questions we have for the main work when we conduct the full excavations. And this is where the Lammas Research Grant and the work of Katie Flacy, Dr. Richard Madgwick, and Jane Stell come into play. The excavation of these remains presented for the first time the opportunity to conduct a comprehensive scientific analysis of individuals buried at the Tower of London, creating a framework for future study and potentially informing the analysis of the surface. And I should say, they're not the only skeletons to be assessed scientifically, but they're the only skeletons to be assessed by modern standards, as the last one was an Iron Age burial, I think excavated in the 80s or 90s, 80s, 70s or 80s. Anyway, so it was hoped that a key part of this process would be radiocarbon dating the largely complete individuals consisting of an adult female between 35 and 50 years of age and a 12 to 14-year-old, and that the fragmentary lower skeleton could be left largely alone, as it was felt by the project team that this would be sufficient to keep destructive sampling to a minimum while giving us all of the information that we need. Typically, these tests hit a flat part of the calibration curve, resulting in the rather wide dates of 1460 to 1634 for the older individual and 1487 to 1640 for the younger. This doesn't dramatically alter the analysis of the finds within the fill of each burial, which still provides the kind of broad, probably 16th century, probably early 16th century, but does not aid in the understanding of the sequence in the way we had hoped. Future questions would be whether or not we decide to do radiocarbon dating on the fragmentary lower skeleton in order to try and get a baseline for the trench. But there are ethical questions about how we conduct that work, because it's possible that we could hit the same point in the curve, in which case it would be useless and we would have destroyed someone's remains for almost nothing. Where more detail could be gathered, though, is through the isotopic analysis of these two individuals. And I should say now that I am a jumped up buildings archaeologist and not a scientist, and this is the work of Katie, Richard, and Jane. And so if you have any deeply scientific questions, you come see me afterwards and I'll give you my email and I'll point you in the right direction of people. So where are we? So the juvenile, who was the lower of the two burials, was excavated lying on the back with hands folded and head facing east, typical of a Christian internment. Traces of enamel hyperplasia were documented, which may suggest nutritional deficiency, which could be indicative of status and quality of life. Or they could simply represent a period of illness during which the person wasn't able to eat as much as they needed. Green copper staining was present on the right eye socket, suggesting shrouding at the time of burial, which is supported by the position of the skull. The isotopic analysis showed that they spent much of their life outside of London, probably in one region for their first decade, and then moving more inland until finally moving to the tower very shortly before their death. It's possible to see the evidence for weaning that they had a relatively normal infancy. However, there is evidence for stress in their later childhood, with at least one growth disrupting event. This stress could result from the move itself when they were taking in less fish and animal protein, but it subsequently appears that they were able to recover at least for a little while until their premature death. The older female skeleton, it was the last burial to be undertaken in the area and was completely undisturbed, and subsequently the most complete. Found that this woman was approximately 1.63 meters tall, or 5'3"-ish, and that joint disease in the form of osteoarthritis was observed in the vertebral column. Diagnostic changes were limited to one joint, so this is probably the result of repetitive action rather than any significant disease. And they also had poor oral health, which would have impacted their eating habits. Once again, remains on their back, east-west orientation, typical of Christian interments, and the skull had lolled to one side and with arms placed at the sides, which indicated burial within a coffin. Evidence of coffin nails was found surrounding this individual, but there was no organic material of the coffin and crucially no coffin plate or anything else, which was identified. There was also copper staining throughout the bones of this individual, but none of either the burial goods or shrouding pins, etc., that would have caused that survived within the trench. The isotopic analysis of this individual showed that they again also had a relatively normal infancy, with a rapid weaning period with the use of plant-based weaning foods. They spent their childhood outside of London and moved with movement between their earlier and later childhood, and then later migration into London. This individual likely had a rich diet from a young age, which exceeded their physiological requirements, so possibly slightly higher status, and with multiple dental caries showing the consumption of sugars. Crucially, I should say, in neither of the skeletons was any cause of death evident, and crucially, no removal of heads could be seen in either of these individuals. So we think probably people who are living and working and then subsequently died at the tower. Overall, the works have enhanced our understanding of the development of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the shifting parameter of the burial ground, but they have also posed significant challenges. Radiocarbon dating has provided some insight into the relative age of the interments, but it cannot be used to definitively tie anything down in any meaningful sense. And that being said, with all of the evidence we have at this point, we're working on the 16th century idea until we can do more excavations and hopefully get a little bit more information about them. The impact on the surface is that it's likely to predate the construction of the current structure, but doesn't appear to be a foundational layer associated with it. But nor does it appear as though it's a significant part of Edward I's initial construction between 1286 and 87. Rather, it appears to be representative of an additional phase of construction associated with that building. But this is the first piece of physical evidence that allows that building to be tentatively located, so it's incredibly exciting and will form the core of the research questions for our future work. In terms of the isotope analysis, this work provides an important snapshot into the everyday lives of people working within the Tower of London and diets within the early post-medieval period, which are frequently lacking. There's still a lot of work for us to do and a lot for us to learn about the people who made the Tower of London their home and the chapel that they worshipped in. But this project has made real progress in applying modern techniques to the fortress, which have enabled us to understand a little bit more about that history. So hopefully this has created a framework for future analysis if anybody else encounters human remains within the fortress. And one day we can start to understand just as much about the people who are living and working and dying at the tower as we do about the kind of grand narratives of Anne Boleyn and so on and so forth. And on that note, I think I'm just over time, but thank you to LAMAS for supporting the work and for the work of Katie, Richard and Jane throughout this project. And hopefully I'll have something more to share with you when we do the main excavations. But that is it.
So there. Right, that was great. Anyone got any questions in the room to start with? And if anyone at home has questions, can you pop them in the Q&A box, please?
Can you just clarify the scope of the excavations that you'll be doing? You showed that drawing briefly.
Yes, I'll go back to that.
I wasn't quite sure where the skeletons were located within that.
Yes, where are we? It is that one. So you can see the existing stairwell. So I'm going to walk out of camera shot. The existing stairwell is this line here, and the skeletons are broadly found in this area. So the feet of all three of the skeletons are located on this side, and the head and various other bits were located near the site. So it was quite an interesting excavation in terms of propping a retaining wall and then excavating 3 skeletons from underneath it.
So they were under the wall? weren't they?
Yes, yeah. So definitely predate all of that kind of alteration of the chapel using that area as an entrance.
And what age was the wall itself then?
Oh, the wall is,
It's modern.
yeah, it's modern. Yeah, it's not particularly interesting. It probably dates from the 1860s.
Which some people would say is quite old.
At the tower, relatively modern. Relatively, still significant, but significant as part of the Victorian remedievalization as opposed to the chapel itself. Anybody else?
Any more questions in the room?
One.
We have one question online. What is the current relationship between the chapels of St. Peter and St. John? That's from Nigel.
They are both still chapel royals and royal peculiars. They are both under the guardianship of the Reverend Canon Roger Hall, and they are both looked after from a maintenance and conservation point of view by historical palaces. So they form 2 halves of the same coin in terms of the chapels in the tower. I think a reasonable way of putting it.
No more questions?
Can't have been that dull.
Slightly off target, but going right back to the early history, you said 1067, I think, for the White Tower masonry. Was there a motte before that? And if not, where were the team defending themselves as the early town was built?
So the establishment of the Tower of London is thought to date from around 1067 with the construction of a ringwork fortification between in the southeastern corner of the existing Roman walls. It's not until between 1078 and 1100 that the White Tower itself is being built. So they would have defended themselves in that special ringwork.
Ask question. I mean, you speculate that the earliest church there was 9th century pre-conquest, and obviously All Hallows is pretty close, which is definitely pre-conquest. And what do we know about the relationship? And what's the sort of nearest pre-conquest established structure? Is that All Hallows?
Yes, the nearest established pre-conquest is All Hallows, as far as I understand it. Most of the assessment of the parishes comes from Haslam's work for parishes, walls and gates in the City of London, where he looks at the relationship between All Hallows, St. Peter's and St. Botolph's Aldgate. So it is something that we need to do a lot of work on, but because the tower has been so thoroughly developed, there's almost no archaeological evidence of the pre-conquest period apart from a lot of Roman stuff. I think we've only ever found 6 sherds of Anglo-Saxon pottery. So the stratigraphy basically goes Roman, skip, Norman, and then on from there, because it looks, Graham Keevil suggested initially that it looks as though the site was actually cleared before the construction of the fortress itself. So there is a lot of work to do, and someone may stumble on some documents that say I'm entirely wrong or entirely right, and either one would be just as exciting, but it's just.
And there's nothing you can infer from the current parish boundaries of All Hallows, which tells you anything.
Not really, partly because the tower liberties, which would have once taken a huge chunk of that area, have been almost completely dissolved. So I think All Hallows now takes some part of what was once the Tower Liberties, and then I think St. Botolph's takes the other bit. It's work in progress. Yes.
No.
No.
I think. Oh, yeah.
No, I just got I was intrigued, you say the Victorians removed all of those skeletons, and they kept no records at all.
There's
everything that they buried there.
It's all overseen by a individual called Doreen Courtney Bell. There's a fabulous publication, The Chapel of the Tower, with notices of burials within the Chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. There are records, but they're not archaeological in any sense. It's very much the kind of antiquarian view of history of these remains are excavated and now taken to the crypt. they're largely unimportant, but here is Anne Boleyn. So there's I think it's the 7th or the 9th of November, 1876 or 7. It's a huge passage saying we uncovered these bones that laid at a depth of 3 feet that had previously been disturbed before. And Dr. Moat, who was observing the words, at once pronounced them to be of slender and perfect proportions and of a woman between 25 and 35 years of age.
Pointy chin.
Yes, of slender and perfect proportions with and the joint, the neck was particularly small, bearing witness to the Queen's little neck. It's from one point of view, it's very much part of that kind of Victorian idea of creating romantic places to visit and creating those stories to enhance these places. And from the other side, it's these people are bound by the methodologies of their time and the use of phrenology that is largely racist and completely unreliable. So it's a difficult one, and there, particularly with Anne Boleyn, there are some things that point to it being a significant individual because they're very these bones came from the chancel, but even their identification as a woman, I've seen osteos observing human remains and being confused on site because some things don't quite match up with what they're expecting, this, that, the other. So it's, I don't really think we can rely on much in terms of the below ground archaeological records from 1876. In terms of the above ground built archaeology of the chapel, it gets, it's kind of a balancing act. The work of Anthony Salvin and John Taylor is quite reliable because it's so well documented by the Office of Works, and particularly Salvin, because he had worked on so many medieval buildings beforehand, like with the replacement of the window in the western elevation. I would be fairly convinced that that is a 1-to-1 scale representation of that window as they found it. Whereas in Bell's book, he assesses some of the same masonry that Robinson has, Jeremy Ackley, that to be part of Henry III's chapel rather than Edward I's chapel. So it's a lot of reinterrogating all of the work that has previously been done and then selecting the bits that look right insofar as our understanding goes. But that's, I mean, that's the joyous thing about working at the tower, and it would be incredibly boring if we knew everything because it's, oh yes, it's town and everybody knows everything about it all the time. And that's one of the things I thought when I arrived, but we're constantly changing our ideas of the development of various buildings as new evidence and new excavations are undertaken. So this is our understanding at the moment. May well completely change in a year when we do the excavations, if Jane lets us do the excavations.
And that's very handy because we have a question from Rose. Hello, Rose, saying, when is the next phase of the work? And it's, yeah, probably not going to be this year because there's a few other big projects to get out of the way just yet. And the whole project is probably going to have to be recosted because it was surprisingly expensive to put the lift in.
Yes.
But lifts have got better.
And hopefully it doesn't need quite as deep a lift shaft as was initially proposed. We're hoping to do the design work this year, this financial year, well, no, next financial year, so from April onwards. And then hopefully the actual installation of the lift would be in 2025, maybe, touch wood. But it would be really good and it would be a win for the tower because there are so few places which are easily accessible. And it's something that I think would be really valuable, particularly for the congregation as well. So alongside weddings, marriages, baptisms, and so on and so forth, the chapel does have regular congregation and has services every week. Quite a number of whom are getting quite old. And so it would be nice if we could make getting in there a little bit easier for them as well.
Okay, I think we will draw everything to a close. Hopefully, if the Lammas journal editors look favourably, Alfred's work will be published in, I'm not sure which journal, but a forthcoming journal. And Alfred has mentioned in the past that he might be up for a Lammas late, so watch this space for that. So thank you for coming. Thank you for everyone that has joined us from their homes. There have been a number of comments about how very much they've all enjoyed it, and there are lots of little clapping hands wandering up and down the screen. So thank you for coming. See you again next time. And if we can thank Alfred again for a fantastic talk.
Oh, Kevin raised a hand. Kevin,
Kevin's-
what's your question? I'm almost.
Yes, everyone can start leaving if they need to be.
There's something about wardrobe.
I think the moment may have passed.
We've got- Kevin, if you're still here, I will call you later.